Hello everyone, my name is Swasti and I work at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses in New Delhi. I focus on the vectors of politics, security and defence of the European countries with regard to larger geopolitics and several pressing international issues. Today, let me ask you a simple question. What keeps the wars running? It is the powerful military industrial complex that lies at the core of all the multi-billion dollar weapons, the cutting edge technologies behind those weapons, and the ability of nations to develop an effective, powerful, and financially viable, very important, financially viable military industrial complex that goes into a nation's ability to win wars and often, unfortunately, coerce other nations not as powerful into escalating a manageable conflict into a deadly war. But then that is a different topic for a different day. Coming back, in the light of security concerns at both our major borders, the number of wars we have fought ever since and have to be perennially ready for, all of it is directly impinging upon one crucial factor. How sufficient are we in our defenses? You see, one problem that India has been grappling with is our dependence on imports, largely from one country, that is Russia. To cut a long story short, that dependence is huge, has reasons for, and is not going away in near future. But the current dispensation has been acutely aware of it and the vulnerability that comes with such structural dependency. That's one lesson that we've learned from Europe. So, for a few years, India has been trying to make steady progress in making itself more self reliant and efficient in the defense sector. So, like I said, making the country self reliant is one part of the story. But diversifying the import basket in terms of technology and better performing equipment is the other side. In the latter, there is huge untapped potential in strategic partnerships with the Europeans that needs some analysis. Like I said, making India self reliant in the domain of defense equipment manufacturing and procurement has been one of the crucial vectors for empowering the country under the ideal of Atmanirbharta or self reliance, and I'm sure everybody has heard of it here, amid a very fluid geopolitics. So, bold reforms and import list restrictions have been launched to speed up this push. What role does Europe play in this crucial matrix? For navigating the complex terrain of convergences with like minded countries, critical drivers need to be identified and operationalized with the required political will and flexibility. However, the various strands of defense cooperation between India and European players is something which is not explored well enough. So there is rhetoric, but rhetoric aside, mutual engagement needs to be etched in realistic terms to maximize the gains that we are looking for from the potential that we have in our cooperation. So that brings us to understanding what really are those critical drivers of self-reliance. Let me tell you briefly one by one. The first is that we need diversification of India's import basket. You see, Russia's war on Ukraine has demystified its formidable military stature, planning, and equipment, and there's no two ways about it. India's neutrality on the war, India's famous neutrality, is related to its massive dependence on arms imports from Russia. However, there's a lot of research that shows that while Russia still remains the single largest supplier to India, nevertheless, the trend indicator values, the TIVs, of India's imports from non-Russian sources have been surging in the last decade. So even before the war started, they've been surging. And this TIV analysis also shows that if this trend continues over the next decade, along with all the efforts that India is making at self-reliance, this margin between Russia's share right now and other suppliers, notably from the West, will shrink further. So this dependence is likely to see further decline also because of the long-standing impact of the Western sanction regime. There are thousands of sanctions which are put on Russia. High-tech military shortages are expected to arise in the Russian military architecture, and sanctions might starve Russia of computer chips and things like semiconductors that could be used in advanced military equipment, which would ultimately denigrate its ability to not only power project in the future, but also, and this is a crucial factor, also in continuing as a dependable supplier to India. Now, you see, Russia has assured India of timely deliveries, not now but in future. But you see, clearly the writing on the wall is that India must diversify in time because it's a long process. What is the second driver? The second driver is to involve private players to improve efficiency of the defense industry. In a very good move, the current budget includes provisions to open up defense research and development and also procurement to the private sector by giving 68% of the capital acquisition budget for purchasing from the domestic industry. And not just that, 25% of the defense R&D budget for the private sector, including startups. So there's also a need to increase spending on R&D itself. India is the world's third largest military spender, which has accounted for almost an 11%, that's whopping 11% share of the global arms trade between 2017 to 2021. That's huge. These arm imports actually reflect poorly on the Indian defense R&D ecosystem. According to one of the Lok Sabha Standing Committee on Defense, it was shown that India's spending on defense R&D is a paltry 6% of the total defense budget compared to, say China's, which is like 20%, and US, which is at 12%. So that is something that the current government is undertaking a series of steps to boost the national R&D base by involving private sector and startups as well. So the good news is, for example, this year, for instance, the union budget has allocated about 1,200 crore for academic defense research. Now, let's come to Europe. Where does Europe fit in? For Europe, Russian war in Ukraine has perpetuated a fundamental restructuring of the global order with appended strategic designs and recalibrated responses, something that I've been telling you again and again. So for the Europeans, it would, among, of course, other things, translate into enhanced cooperation with relevant strategic partners, and of course, I mean India here, in the Indo-Pacific and building on interoperability, especially when we're talking about defense. Not just that, Russia's growing arms relationship with China has been a destabilizing factor for India. The post-Cold War era saw Russia's posture changing from refusing to sell weapons to China on the one hand to now providing both countries, which is India and China, with identical technologies, and I mean the S-400s. So that is something that India is very worried about. Now let us look at what is India's defense offset policy and how does Europe fit in. You see, the 2016 DOP has been the chief instrument for India to develop its indigenous defense manufacturing sector. So as per the DOP, the defense offset policy, for any purchases over rupees 2,000 crore, a foreign company has to ensure a 30% domestic value addition in India. So that's one. Next came the Defense Acquisition Procedure, which is DAP, which happened in 2020, which was the second attempt by the Modi government to streamline India's defense procurement system and promote the ideal of Make in India in defense manufacturing. So the DAP, what it does is that it puts emphasis on higher indigenous content in procurement and faster acquisition. So, we know that our acquisition takes forever, so sort of streamlining it. Now, you see, India hopes that Europe will cooperate along the lines of the 2016 and 2020 reforms and will promote India's DOP. And, well, there has been some progress, but impediments keep springing from time to time. So let us now look at one of those impediments, which is that Europeans don't finish as the lowest bidders, which is the L1. The Europeans have hardly ever emerged as the lowest bidder for India, and that slot has often been taken up by Russia. You see, Moscow's power in this domain derives not only from the sheer volume of sales to India, but from its willingness, and that's an important point, a willingness to provide weapons, systems, and technologies that no other country will export to India because of their own national regulations, or perhaps, their willingness that they will only do it at a cost which is unaffordable to India. So, however, lowest bidding is not an obstacle anymore. So, that's the good news. Cheapest deals do matter, but India has been forthcoming in identifying critical technologies and requirements, and that has superseded sometimes the lowest bidders when a certain quality was required. So we have gone for G2G, decisions even when they did not finish as lowest bidders. The Europeans have also been willing to meet DAP guidelines. But what India has not been able to convince the Europeans of is operating Russian-style joint ventures. Now, this is a very interesting point as to what do we mean by the Russian-style joint ventures. You see, Russia has not become India's closest defense partner for decades for nothing, okay? Russia provides India with top of the line technology at prices which are affordable. And not just that, whenever it comes to joint ventures, and there are so many examples of the BrahMos missiles, etc., they operate in a way which is extremely flexible, okay, and which, by a lot of analysts has been called the no strings attached, approach of the Russians as compared to Europeans, which like to, sort of have better control over, how the production lines are functioning, how the ancillary units are functioning, and are not happy with not really interfering at all. So that is what I mean when I say the joint ventures Russian style. Now, let me tell you a bit about France's unique position among Europeans. France is by far the closest defense partner for India in Europe. Apart from the well-known Rafale fighter jet deal, there has been cooperation in the Mirage fighters and their upgrade, all of which are of vital importance to the Indian Navy and Air Force. India had also entered into a 4 billion contract with a French firm to build 6 Scorpene submarines, but the project has been reset to the request for proposal stage, which means pretty initial stage right now. You see, France has considerably scaled up defense cooperation with India by offering not just the ones that I told you about, but also the Barracuda nuclear submarines last year with a Make in India element. You see, shortly after the Rafale deal, this particular French offer to provide India with the know-how to make nuclear submarines has the potential to establish France as India's preeminent defense partner, a position that is currently held and enjoyed only by Russia. A few years ago, in 2019, the Indian Air Force issued a request for information or initial tender to acquire 114 multi-role fighter aircraft, the MRFAs, jets, at a cost of around $20 billion. This deal was hailed as one of the world's biggest military procurement programs in recent years to be carried out under the Make in India initiative. So this year, in 2022, the top contenders for this deal include Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Dassault Aviation's Rafale, the Eurofighter Typhoon, the Russian MiG-35, and also Saab's Gripen. Rafale by far is the closest contender, so we are hoping that France will get this deal. Now, let us look at another interesting route to indigenization. How can private players' involvement can be maximized in indigenization efforts? Let me tell you an interesting scenario. Only a few finished pieces of the K9 Vajra T guns were imported from South Korea. A conduit was identified in India, who then got knockdown kits from South Korea and simply assembled them in India in tune with our DAP program guidelines. Similarly, in the other case of M777 ultralight howitzers from the US, the same logic was applied, that the knockdown kits were brought in by a conduit and assembled. However, when we look at Europe, the only popular example that catches our imagination is still the Czech Republic's Tatras, the huge trucks. So We picked up a conduit who got those knockdown kits from the Czech Republic, and that conduit, BEML, has been assembling it for years in India. And that, I agree that it seems like a compromise, but it works well as a route to indigenize defense procurement by upping the involvement of private players as per the DAP 2020 guidelines. So the point is that this route should be better explored for expanding cooperation with the Europeans, because Europeans are not very comfortable with transfer of technology right now. India's challenges, however, lie in developing a fully fledged domestic industrial base and using it to positively influence its defense partnerships. But you see, none of the above that I've been talking about will get the desired impact until efficient coordination at our end is worked upon. That is where our bigger problem is. You see, recently, France backed out from developing those 6 conventional submarines, the Scorpion submarines, for India due to air-independent propulsion, which is AIP system issues. It's a technical issue. Not only France, but other original equipment manufacturers or OEMs, including Germany and Russia, backed out as well. Now, backing out is not a problem. For a foreign player to back out after the RFP, the request for proposal, has already been floated, reflects bureaucratic hurdles and lack of coordination at the level of ministries, the armed forces, and the Defence Research and Development Organization, which is the DRDO, in formulating the RFP with unambiguous requirements before shortlisting the OEMs. It should be noted that the P75 project has been on since 2008 when the first RFP was floated, but it's been getting delayed ever since. So once again, the P75 RFP deadline has been extended to December 2022, which is this year. The other problem is how India views Europe. So defense cooperation between India and European countries is, in many respects, highly fragmented. The European Union is not really seen by India as a whole, but as a group of countries. So as a result, what happens is that it engages with each one separately on a bilateral and case-by-case basis, and not collectively and strategically over multiple projects, with, of course, right now an exception of France. Europe, on the other hand, also has some problems which it needs to address. One is that Europe needs to understand India's continental and maritime security challenges and has to realize that an empowered India is in the best interest of Europe's Indo-Pacific worldview. So, we can say that despite limitations, pragmatic choices will continue to be at the core of India's defense industrial strategy and defense cooperation with strategic allies in Europe, and this cooperation is likely to deepen. So I'll be back soon again with yet another facet of international politics and an issue that needs better analysis. Stay tuned.